The morning of October 15, 1964, broke cold and clear over New York's Idlewild Airport. A thin layer of frost covered the tarmac, melting slowly under the weak autumn sun. Inside the terminal, passengers shuffled through the departure gates with the peculiar mixture of excitement and exhaustion that characterized early morning flights. Captain Richard Mallory stood before the cockpit window of Flight 9 Wharf Tour, a Douglas DC-4 bound for Miami, completing his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of a man who had performed this ritual thousands of times. At 42 years old, with 17 years of commercial flying experience, Mallory was considered one of the airline's most reliable pilots. His co-pilot, James Chen, a younger man of 30 with sharp eyes and quick reflexes, sat beside him reviewing weather reports. "Clear skies all the way to Florida," Chen remarked, tapping the meteorological documents. "Should be smooth sailing." Mallory nodded, his weathered hands moving across the instrument panel with practiced ease. Behind them, in the passenger cabin, 57 souls settled into their seats. There were businessmen in dark suits, their briefcases tucked under seats, young families with restless children, heading south for vacation, elderly couples seeking warmth, a newly married pair in the back row, holding hands and whispering excitedly about their honeymoon in Key West. Among the passengers was Margaret Foster, a schoolteacher from Brooklyn traveling to visit her sister in Tampa. She clutched a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird in her lap, published just 4 years earlier. Beside her sat Thomas Brennan, a salesman for a typewriter company, already dozing despite the early hour. 3 rows back, young Sarah Mitchell, only 8 years old, pressed her face against the window, watching ground crew members load luggage into the cargo hold. The head flight attendant, Barbara Whitmore, an elegant woman in her 30s with auburn hair pinned in the style of the day, moved through the cabin with practiced grace, checking seat belts and offering reassuring smiles. She had been flying for 12 years and prided herself on making even the most nervous passengers feel at ease. At 9:47 a.m., the tower cleared Flight 9 Warteen for takeoff. The engines roared to life, their powerful drone drowning out all other sounds. The aircraft began its roll down the runway, picking up speed, the painted lines blurring beneath the wheels. At precisely the right moment, Mallory pulled back on the yoke and the DC-4 lifted gracefully into the air. The plane climbed steadily through the crisp October morning, banking slightly as it turned southward. Below, the sprawling urban landscape of New York gradually gave way to the greener expanses of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Inside the cabin, passengers relaxed. Some read newspapers filled with headlines about the upcoming presidential election between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. Others simply gazed out at the clouds. Mallory leveled the aircraft at its cruising altitude of 18,000 feet. The flight plan was straightforward, a direct route following the Atlantic coastline, with an estimated flight time of 2 hours and 45 minutes. Everything was proceeding exactly as expected. At 10:23 a.m., Mallory reached for the radio to check in with air traffic control in Washington. Washington Center, this is Flight 914, currently over Wilmington, Delaware, maintaining 18,000, all systems normal. Static crackled briefly before the response came. Flight 9 Wharf Tour, Washington Center. Roger that. Maintain present course and altitude. Contact Miami Center when you pass Jacksonville. Wilco, Washington, Mallory replied, settling back in his seat. Chen adjusted some instruments and glanced at his captain. "Coffee?" he asked, preparing to signal the cabin crew. Before Mallory could respond, something extraordinary happened. The sky around them began to shimmer. At first it was barely noticeable, a slight distortion in the air like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But within seconds, the effect intensified. The blue sky seemed to ripple and fold, colors bleeding and swirling in impossible patterns. The instruments on the panel began to flicker erratically. The compass spun wildly. The altimeter needle jumped up and down. What the hell? Chen grabbed the controls, his knuckles white. Mallory stared at the windscreen where the world outside had transformed into a churning vortex of light and shadow. This isn't possible." The aircraft shuddered violently. In the cabin, passengers screamed as luggage fell from overhead compartments. Barbara grabbed a seat back to steady herself, her professional composure cracking. The lights flickered on and off. The engine's steady roar became an uneven whine. "Mayday, mayday!" Mallory shouted into the radio. "Washington Center, this is Flight 9 Wartour. We are experiencing..." His words were swallowed by a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The entire aircraft was engulfed in a brilliant white light so intense that both pilots had to shield their eyes. The sensation was indescribable, like being pulled in every direction simultaneously, like falling and flying and standing still all at once. And then, silence. Complete, absolute silence. The light vanished. The shaking stopped. The instrument steadied. Mallory blinked, trying to clear the spots from his vision. Beside him, Chen was breathing heavily, his face pale. "Jim, are you okay?" Mallory asked, his voice hoarse. I think so." "What was that?" Mallory looked out the windscreen. They were still flying, still at altitude. The sky was blue and clear. Below he could see land, green fields, forests, what appeared to be a coastline in the distance. Everything looked normal, but something felt profoundly wrong. "Check all systems," Mallory ordered, his training overriding his shock. Chen ran through the instruments. "Everything reads normal now. Fuel, hydraulics, engines, all green. It's like nothing happened, but something had happened." Mallory could feel it in his bones. He reached for the radio. "Washington Center, this is Flight 914. Do you copy?" Static. He tried again. "Washington Center, Flight 914, requesting immediate assistance. We experienced some kind of anomaly. Please respond." More static, then suddenly a voice broke through, but it wasn't the familiar Washington controller. "Aircraft calling. Please identify yourself. This is Miami International Tower." Mallory frowned. Miami? That was impossible. They couldn't have covered that distance so quickly. "Miami Tower, this is Flight 914, a DC-4 en route from New York to Miami. We departed Idlewild at 09:47 hours. We experienced some kind of atmospheric disturbance and lost contact with Washington Center. Request position confirmation and approach instructions." There was a long pause. When the controller's voice returned, it sounded uncertain, confused. "Flight 914, did you say you departed from Idlewild?" "Affirmative, Miami. Idlewild Airport, New York. Is there a problem?" Another pause. Longer this time. Mallory could hear muffled voices in the background, people talking urgently. Finally, the controller came back on, his voice carefully controlled. "Flight 914, please maintain present heading and altitude. We're going to need you to stand by." "Stand by? We need approach clearance. We have 57 passengers on board who—" "Sir, please maintain present course. We have you on radar. Just give us a moment." Mallory exchanged a bewildered look with Chen. In the cabin, Barbara appeared at the cockpit door, her face tight with concern. "Captain, the passengers are very frightened. What happened? What do I tell them?" "Tell them we experienced some severe turbulence, but everything is under control now," Mallory said, trying to sound confident. "We'll be landing in Miami shortly." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Below, the landscape continued to slide by, but something about it seemed different, unfamiliar. The patterns of development, the roads, nothing quite matched what he remembered from previous flights along this route. The radio crackled again. "Flight 914, Miami Tower. Sir, we need to ask you some questions. What is your departure date?" "Departure date?" Mallory repeated, confused by the odd question. "October 15th, 1964. Today. What's going on down there?" There was no immediate response. The silence stretched so long that Mallory thought they'd lost contact. Then finally a different voice came through, older, more authoritative. "Flight 914, this is Miami Center Supervisor. I need you to remain calm and answer my questions carefully. You said you departed from Idlewild Airport on October 15th, 1964. "Yes, that's correct. And what is the current date according to your calculations?" Mallory glanced at his watch at the cockpit chronometer. "Still October 15th. We've only been in the air about 40 minutes. "Why are you asking these questions?" "We need to land. We have passengers." "Sir, I understand, but I need you to listen to me very carefully. According to our records, there is no active flight plan for a Flight 914 from New York today. Furthermore, Idlewild Airport hasn't existed under that name for many years. It was renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport in 1963. Mallory felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about? That doesn't make sense." "Sir, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to process. According to our instruments, according to our calendar, the current date is November 22nd, 2008. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Mallory stared at the radio, certain he'd misheard. "Say again, Miami?" "The year is 2008, Captain." not 1964. Somehow your aircraft has arrived 44 years in the future. For a long moment, the cockpit of Flight 914 was silent except for the steady drone of the engines. Mallory and Chen looked at each other, their faces reflecting identical expressions of disbelief and growing horror. "That's impossible," Mallory finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's completely impossible." The supervisor's voice remained calm, professional. "I understand this is extremely difficult to accept, Captain, but I'm looking at your aircraft on our radar right now, and I can assure you that what I'm telling you is the truth. You're flying a DC-4, correct? A type of aircraft that hasn't been used for commercial passenger service in the United States for decades." Chen leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the instrument panel. "This has to be some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe we got turned around. Maybe we're not where we think we are. Your transponder is broadcasting clearly." The supervisor interrupted gently. "We have your exact position. You're approximately 40 miles northeast of Miami International Airport. But, Captain Mallory, I need you to focus now. Your fuel situation. How much do you have remaining?" Mallory forced himself to look at the fuel gauge. The needle showed they were running low, much lower than they should have been for a 40-minute flight. "We're down to about 30 minutes of fuel. That doesn't make sense either. We should have had—" "It's been longer than 40 minutes for your aircraft, sir. Even if it didn't feel that way to you, we need to get you on the ground immediately. Are you prepared to follow approach instructions?" Mallory swallowed hard, pushing aside the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Whatever had happened, whatever impossible thing they were being told, his primary responsibility was to his passengers and crew. "Affirmative, Miami. We're ready for approach instructions." "Good. Now, I need to warn you that the airport is going to look very different from what you remember. The equipment, the other aircraft, the buildings, everything has changed significantly. I need you to focus only on following our instructions and not let the visual differences distract you. Can you do that?" "Understood." As the supervisor began guiding them through the approach pattern, Mallory finally looked down at the landscape below with fresh eyes. Now that he was looking for differences, they were everywhere. The city of Miami sprawled far beyond what he remembered, a vast urban expanse where before there had been wetlands and undeveloped land. Highways crisscrossed the terrain in complex patterns. The buildings were taller, more numerous, reflecting glass and steel where once had been modest structures. "Jim," he said quietly to his co-pilot, "maybe you should go back and prepare the cabin for landing. Brief Barbara, but don't tell the passengers anything yet, not until we're safely on the ground." Chen nodded mutely and left the cockpit looking pale and shaken. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was tense. The mysterious turbulence had frightened everyone, and the extended silence from the cockpit had only increased their anxiety. Mothers clutched children close. Men loosened their ties and mopped sweating brows. Margaret Foster had abandoned her book and was praying quietly, her lips moving soundlessly. Barbara intercepted Chen as he emerged from the cockpit. "What's happening?" she whispered urgently. Chen opened his mouth, closed it, then simply said, "We're landing in Miami now. Make sure everyone is secured." His eyes held a wild, desperate quality that frightened her more than any words could have. As Flight 914 descended, passing through 5,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 1,500 feet, Mallory could see the airport ahead. It was massive, utterly transformed from the airport he had landed at dozens of times before. Where there had been 2 runways, now there were 4. The terminal buildings were enormous, modernistic structures of glass and concrete. And the aircraft, dozens of them, in liveries he didn't recognize. Sleek machines that looked more like something from a science fiction magazine than real airplanes. "Flight 914, you are cleared to land runway 27, the controller's voice said. "Emergency equipment is standing by as a precaution." "Roger, cleared to land 27, Mallory acknowledged, trying to keep his voice steady. The DC-4's landing gear lowered with its familiar hydraulic whine. The flaps extended. The old aircraft, built in an era of different engineering principles, responded faithfully to its pilot's commands. Whatever impossible thing had happened to transport them through time, the plane itself remained solid, real, comprehensible. The wheels touched concrete with a gentle bump. Mallory applied the brakes and the aircraft rolled to a stop at the end of the runway. Through the windscreen, he could see fire trucks and emergency vehicles racing toward them, their lights flashing in patterns that seemed both familiar and strange. "Welcome to 2008, Captain Mallory." the supervisor's voice said softly over the radio. Behind the aircraft, following at a respectful distance, were several unmarked black vehicles. As Flight 915 was directed to taxi to an isolated area far from the main terminal, Mallory realized that their arrival, impossible as it was, had not gone unnoticed by more than just air traffic control. The engines finally shut down, their noise fading to silence. For a moment, Mallory simply sat in the pilot's seat, his hand still resting on the controls, unable to move. Through the windscreen, he watched as men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, along with airport officials and what appeared to be military personnel. Chen returned to the cockpit, his face ashen. The passengers are asking questions. What do we tell them? Mallory slowly unbuckled his harness and stood, his legs unsteady. The truth, I suppose, though God knows how we're going to explain it. They opened the aircraft door to find a mobile stairway already in place. At the bottom stood a middle-aged man in a dark suit, flanked by airport security and several individuals who clearly weren't simply airport officials. The man looked up at Mallory with an expression that mixed wonder, disbelief, and something else, perhaps fear. "Captain Mallory?" the man called up. "I'm Agent David Morrison with the Federal Aviation Administration. I need you and your passengers to disembark slowly and calmly. We have medical personnel standing by." "We don't need medical personnel," Mallory called back. "We need answers. What the hell happened to us?" Morrison's expression remained neutral. "We'll discuss everything, Captain. But first, let's get everyone off the aircraft, please." The passengers disembarked in a state of confusion and growing alarm. Little Sarah Mitchell clung to her mother's hand, her earlier excitement replaced by fear. Thomas Brennan, the salesman, kept demanding to know why they were being met by what looked like federal agents. The honeymooning couple in the back row held each other tightly, sensing that something was profoundly wrong. As Margaret Foster descended the stairs, she happened to glance at one of the airport vehicles nearby. Through its window, she could see a newspaper on the dashboard. The date on the masthead made her freeze mid-step, causing the person behind her to bump into her back. November 22nd, 2008. "That's wrong," she said aloud. "That date is wrong." But more than the date captured her attention. The newspaper itself looked different, the printing clearer, the images sharper, and beyond the vehicle she could see the airport terminal, its massive glass walls revealing an interior filled with screens, electronic displays, and people moving with devices in their hands that glowed and flickered. Everything looked like something from a World's Fair exhibition, like a vision of the future. "Oh my God," she whispered. The passengers were quickly ushered into a secure area of the airport, a conference room that had been hastily prepared. Medical teams began checking vital signs, asking questions. But the passengers' questions came faster. Where were they? Why had they been met by federal agents? What had happened during the flight? Finally, Agent Morrison stood before the assembled group. His face was grave and he spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to tell you will be very difficult to understand and accept, but I assure you that everything I say is the absolute truth." He paused, taking a deep breath. "You departed from New York this morning, October 15th, 1964. However, your aircraft did not arrive in Miami until today, November 22nd, 2008. Somehow, during your flight, you traveled not just through space, but through time. 44 years have passed in the outside world, though for you it has been less than an hour." The room erupted in chaos. Shouts of disbelief, accusations of insanity, demands for real explanations. Some passengers laughed, certain this was an elaborate joke. Others simply stared, their minds struggling to process the impossible information. Margaret Foster raised her hand, her teacher's instinct for order asserting itself even in this surreal moment. When Morrison acknowledged her, she asked in a remarkably steady voice, "Can you prove this?" Morrison nodded to an assistant, who wheeled in a television, a flat-screen device the passengers had never seen before. It flickered to life, showing a news broadcast. The images were impossibly clear, more vivid than any television the passengers had ever watched. And the content of the news was utterly foreign. References to wars they hadn't heard of, technologies that sounded like fantasy, political figures whose names meant nothing to them. Then the assistant pulled out a laptop computer and connected to something called the Internet. Within seconds, images and information from around the world appeared on the screen. A search for 1964 brought up historical information, photographs labeled as being from 44 years ago. "How?" whispered Thomas Brennan. "How is this possible?" "We don't know," Morrison admitted. We have teams of scientists, physicists, experts from around the country being assembled as we speak. But as of this moment, we have no explanation for how your aircraft traveled through time. In the back of the room, Captain Mallory sat with his head in his hands. 44 years. His wife, Emily, had been 38 in 1964. If she was still alive, she would be 82 now. His children, Michael had been 15, Susan only 12. They would be grown, middle-aged. They would have lived entire lives while he had been gone. Barbara Whitmore stood by a window, staring out at the modern airport. She was 33 years old. In the world beyond this room, if the impossible was true, she would be 77. Her parents, who had been elderly in 1964, would surely be gone. Her younger sister would be an old woman. "I want to go home," Sarah Mitchell sobbed in her mother's arms. "I want to go home." But where was home? The Brooklyn they had left that morning no longer existed, not as they knew it. The world they had known, the lives they had been living, had vanished in a moment of white light and impossible silence. Morrison continued speaking, outlining what would happen next. They would be thoroughly examined by doctors. Psychologists would be available to help them process the trauma. Government officials needed to debrief them extensively about what they had experienced. And then eventually, they would have to decide what to do with their lives in this strange new world. "What about our families?" someone called out. "The people we left behind? We're already beginning to locate them," Morrison said quietly. "For those who are still alive, arrangements will be made for you to reconnect. But I must warn you, 44 years is a long time. The people you knew have changed, have aged. The world has changed. Nothing will be as you remember it." As the passengers were led away to medical facilities, Mallory found himself alone with Morrison for a moment. "My crew," he said. "Chen, Barbara, the other flight attendants. They were just doing their jobs. They didn't ask for this." "None of you did, Captain," Morrison replied. "But it happened nonetheless. And now, we all have to deal with the consequences. Do you have any idea what caused it? Any theories at all?" Morrison hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing that makes sense. There were no unusual weather patterns that day in 1964. No solar flares, no magnetic anomalies, nothing in the sky that could explain what happened to your aircraft. It's as if you simply slipped through a crack in time itself." Mallory laughed bitterly. "That sounds like something from a pulp science fiction story." "I know, but here you are." The next several weeks existed in a strange limbo for the passengers and crew of Flight 942. They were housed in a government facility on the outskirts of Miami, a comfortable but isolated compound where teams of doctors, scientists, and government officials could observe and study them. Every day brought new revelations about the world they now inhabited, each more staggering than the last. They learned about computers small enough to fit in a pocket, more powerful than the room-sized machines they remembered from 1964. They discovered that humans had walked on the moon, just as Kennedy had promised. But that space exploration had become almost routine, with stations orbiting the Earth continuously. They watched in wonder and horror as historians and experts explained the wars, political upheavals, and social changes that had transformed America and the world during their lost decades. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Berlin Wall had fallen. A black man was about to become president of the United States. The very concept seemed impossible to most of them, yet here was the evidence before their eyes. For Margaret Foster, the changes in education and society both thrilled and disturbed her. Women's rights had advanced far beyond what she had imagined possible, but she also learned about new challenges: drugs, violence, the breakdown of communities she had known. She spent hours in the facility's library, reading voraciously, trying to understand the history she had missed. Thomas Brennan discovered that his typewriter company no longer existed, absorbed and dismantled decades ago as personal computers had revolutionized office work. The very profession he had mastered had become obsolete. He struggled with this knowledge, feeling as if his entire identity had been erased. Young Sarah Mitchell, perhaps more adaptable than the adults around her, was fascinated by everything. The colors of the television shows, the video games, the animated movies, all of it seemed magical to her. But at night she cried for her grandmother, whom she learned had died in 1979, and for her father, who had remarried after her mother had been declared legally dead in 1971. The honeymooners, Daniel and Christine Hayes, faced perhaps the cruelest revelation. They learned that after the disappearance of Flight 914, their families had searched for years, never accepting that the plane had simply vanished. Christine's mother had died, still hoping for news. Daniel's father had spent his retirement trying to pressure the government for answers. Their love, so fresh and new in 1964, now existed in a world where everything and everyone they had known was gone or transformed beyond recognition. For the crew, the burden was perhaps heaviest. Captain Mallory was eventually allowed a supervised visit with his family. What remained of it? His wife, Emily, had died 6 years earlier, in 2002. She had never remarried, had spent decades trying to learn the truth about her husband's disappearance. His son, Michael, now 59 years old, looked at him with a mixture of joy and resentment, having grown up without a father. His daughter, Susan, 56, broke down crying the moment she saw him, then couldn't stop touching his face, his hands, as if to confirm he was real. "We held memorial services," Michael told him during their second meeting, his voice tight. "Mom kept a picture of you on her nightstand until the day she died. She used to talk to it every night." Mallory sat across from his middle-aged children he had last seen at breakfast on October 15, 1964, arguing over who would get the last piece of toast, and couldn't find words adequate to the moment. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he had been gone for only an hour from his perspective? Nothing seemed sufficient. Barbara Whitmore's reunion with her sister was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Martha was 71 now, confined to a wheelchair after a stroke 3 years earlier. She wept when she saw Barbara, still young, still vibrant, while she had become elderly and frail. "I prayed for you to come back," Martha whispered, holding Barbara's hand with trembling fingers. "But I never imagined it would be like this. You're younger than my own children now." James Chen had no family left to find. His parents had died in the 1970s, and he had been an only child. In a way, this made things simpler for him. If anything about their situation could be called simple. He had no complicated relationships to navigate, no aged loved ones to remind him of all he had lost. As winter turned to spring in 2009, the government faced a unique dilemma: what to do with 57 people who legally shouldn't exist. They had been declared dead decades ago. Their social security numbers were invalid. They had no credit history in the modern sense, no valid identification, no records beyond what had been preserved in archives. A special congressional committee was formed to address their situation. After months of deliberation, a solution was crafted. The passengers and crew of Flight 912 would be given new legal identities, backdated documents, and financial support to help them integrate into modern society. They would receive compensation for their lost years, and extensive counseling and education programs would be provided. But the question remained: how could they truly integrate into a world so radically different from the one they had known? Captain Mallory, after much soul-searching, decided to learn about modern aviation. He spent months in simulators, learning to fly aircraft that would have seemed like alien technology to him in 1964. Eventually, he secured a position as a flight instructor, teaching the next generation of pilots. His story was kept confidential by agreement with the government, but among aviation circles, rumors persisted about an instructor who flew with an old-fashioned style and an uncanny appreciation for aircraft history. He never fully reconciled with his children. The gap was simply too wide, the loss too profound. Michael had needed a father during crucial years, and that father hadn't been there. That Mallory had a valid excuse didn't erase the pain, but they maintained contact. Awkward video calls and occasional visits. He met his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, marveling at a future that had come to pass without him. Margaret Foster, after extensive coursework to update her educational credentials, returned to teaching. She found work at a middle school in suburban Miami, teaching history, and what a unique perspective she brought to the subject. To her, the civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate weren't distant historical events, but things that had happened during her missing years. Her students found her teaching style old-fashioned but oddly compelling. She never told them her secret, but she brought a passion to her work that came from understanding viscerally how quickly time could slip away. She never married. The one man she had been interested in, before her fateful flight, had married someone else in 1967 and passed away in 2004. Instead, she poured her energy into her students, into books, into understanding this new world she inhabited. Thomas Brennan struggled more than most. His profession was gone, his skills obsolete. He tried various jobs, retail, food service, factory work, but felt adrift, purposeless. Eventually, He found an unexpected calling, working with other displaced people, refugees and immigrants who also found themselves in an America they didn't fully understand. His own experience of displacement gave him empathy and insight that helped others navigate their own difficult transitions. It wasn't the life he had imagined in 1964, but it had meaning. The Hayeses, the honeymooners, made perhaps the most remarkable adjustment. They had each other, which was more than most of the other passengers could say. After the initial shock wore off, they chose to embrace the strange gift they had been given. They had been newlyweds in 1964, and they were still newlyweds in 2009. They had decades of life ahead of them, in a world full of wonders they had never imagined. Daniel learned computer programming. He had an analytical mind that adapted well to the logical structures of code. Christine became a nurse, finding that her capacity for compassion and care was needed as much in 2009 as it would have been in 1964. They bought a small house, raised children, and lived a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. On their anniversaries, they would sometimes look at each other and marvel at the impossibility of their existence. Young Sarah Mitchell was adopted by a distant cousin of her mother's. Her mother had suffered a complete breakdown and was institutionalized, unable to cope with the impossible reality. Sarah grew up with therapy, counseling, and the strange knowledge that she was both a child and a relic of the past. She became fascinated by psychology and eventually earned a doctorate, specializing in trauma and displacement. Her dissertation, published years later, would draw on her own experiences without explicitly revealing her identity. Barbara Whitmore, after watching her sister's health decline until Martha's death in 2011, dedicated herself to working with elderly people. She became a nurse's aide in an assisted living facility and found a strange comfort in caring for people who were the age she should have been. She never married, never had children. The time displacement had left her feeling unmoored from normal life rhythms, but she found purpose in small acts of kindness, in helping others through their final years. James Chen took a different path. He became obsessed with understanding what had happened to them. He taught himself physics, read everything he could find about temporal anomalies, quantum mechanics, Einstein's theories. He attended public lectures, corresponded with scientists, and assembled a massive archive of information about temporal displacement theories. He knew he would never solve the mystery. It was beyond his expertise, beyond perhaps anyone's expertise, but the searching gave him purpose. As the years passed, the passengers and crew of Flight 915 gradually dispersed, moving to different cities, pursuing different lives. Some maintained contact, finding comfort in shared experience. Others preferred to leave that chapter behind, to integrate as fully as possible into their new present. By 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic swept the world, the survivors of Flight 915 experienced yet another surreal disruption to normal life, but this time they faced it alongside everyone else. In a strange way, some of them found the pandemic's upheaval easier to handle than most people. They had already experienced the world turning upside down once before. Captain Mallory, now elderly in appearance, though technically still only in his 60s, retired from teaching in 2022. He spent his final years writing a memoir that was published posthumously, titled The Lost Hours: My Journey Through Time. It became a bestseller, though many readers assumed it was fiction or exaggeration. He died in his sleep in January 2024, at the chronological age of 102, though he had only lived through 62 years of subjective time. At his funeral, his son Michael, himself now elderly, delivered a eulogy that tried to capture the impossible complexity of his father's life. My father missed my childhood, my adolescence, my entire adult life up to middle age, Michael said, his voice breaking. He wasn't there for graduations, weddings, the birth of his grandchildren, but it wasn't his choice. He didn't abandon us. He simply skipped forward, through no fault of his own. And in the years we did have together, years that came too late but came nonetheless, I learned that love doesn't really care about time. It exists outside of chronology. My father loved me in 1964, and he loved me in 2020, and somehow that love bridged the impossible gap between those years. The mystery of Flight 914's temporal displacement was never solved. Numerous investigations, studies, and research projects failed to produce a definitive explanation. The aircraft itself was taken to a secure facility and examined exhaustively. No unusual properties were found. It was simply an ordinary DC-4, built in 1943, showing normal wear and tear for its age in 1964, and no additional aging from its journey through time. Theories abounded. Some scientists suggested the plane had encountered a previously unknown natural phenomenon, perhaps related to quantum fluctuations in spacetime. Others proposed more exotic explanations: wormholes, parallel dimensions, cosmic strings. A few suggested the plane had briefly achieved a velocity or trajectory that had somehow triggered relativistic time dilation, though the physics of this seemed impossible given the aircraft's capabilities. Conspiracy theorists had their own ideas, of course. Government experiments, alien intervention, secret military technology, all were proposed and endlessly debated online. The government's agreement to keep the passengers' identities confidential only fueled speculation. But for those who had lived through it, the why mattered less than the how to keep living, how to find meaning, how to reconcile being both out of time and in it simultaneously. Barbara Whitmore, in her later years, wrote in her private journal, "I used to think of October 15th, 1964 as the day my life ended, but I've come to realize that's wrong. It was the day one life ended and another began. I've lived two lives in two different eras. How many people can say that? The pain of what was lost is real. The grief is real. But so is everything that came after. So is every patient I comforted, every hand I held, every small kindness I could offer. Time took from me, but it also gave. I just had to learn to accept both truths." In 2032, Sarah Mitchell, now Dr. Sarah Mitchell Chen, having married James Chen's nephew in a strange twist that both found oddly appropriate, organized a reunion of the surviving passengers and crew of Flight 949. Only 11 were still alive. They gathered in Miami, not far from where they had landed that impossible day in 2008. They shared stories, memories, and photographs. They marveled at how their lives had unfolded in ways none could have predicted on that October morning, when they had simply boarded a routine flight to Miami. Some had found happiness in this future they had been thrust into. Others had struggled but survived. All bore the mark of their unique experience. As the evening wore on and the group grew quieter, Margaret Foster, now 91 years old, still sharp and articulate, raised her glass in a toast. "To Flight 914, she said. "To the journey we never asked for and the future we learned to inhabit. To the ones we lost both in 1964 and in all the years since. To the impossible being possible. And to the stubborn human capacity to keep living, keep loving, keep hoping, even when time itself becomes strange." They drank, and in that moment, they were united not just by shared experience, but by shared survival. They had been torn from their lives, thrown forward into an unknown world, and somehow, impossibly, improbably, they had endured. That night, before returning to her hotel, Sarah stood on the beach looking out at the Atlantic Ocean. Somewhere beyond the horizon was New York, where she had boarded a plane one ordinary morning in 1964. That city still existed, but it was transformed beyond recognition. The Brooklyn of her childhood was as lost to her as ancient Rome, but she was still here, still breathing, still thinking, still feeling. The ocean looked the same as it always had, vast, mysterious, indifferent to human notions of time and loss. The waves came in and went out with the same rhythm they had followed for millions of years, would follow for millions more. She thought about the theories, the speculation, the endless attempts to explain what had happened. Maybe they would never know. Maybe the universe had simply hiccuped, reality had glitched, and Flight 914 had slipped through a crack in the cosmic order. Or maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation they simply hadn't discovered yet. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had lived through it. They all had. 57 people had taken off from New York in 1964 and landed in Miami in 2008, and in the years since, they had found ways to build lives in this strange new world. It wasn't the life she had planned. It wasn't the future she had imagined, but it was hers, and that would have to be enough. Behind her, from the hotel, she could hear the others laughing at some shared memory. Daniel Hayes doing an impression of their shock at seeing the first iPhone. Barbara reminiscing about trying to understand reality television. Thomas telling the story of the first time he had used Google and realized the entirety of human knowledge was accessible in seconds. They had lived through the impossible and emerged changed but unbroken. They had been displaced in time but had found, against all odds, a place in the world that had replaced the one they knew. And somehow, in some way Sarah couldn't quite articulate but deeply felt, that was its own kind of miracle. The waves continued their ancient rhythm. The stars wheeled overhead, same as they ever were, same as they ever would be. And somewhere in the fabric of reality, perhaps there were other travelers, other journeys, other impossible stories waiting to unfold. But that was a mystery for another time, another flight, another group of unlikely time travelers. For now, on this beach in 2032, Dr. Sarah Mitchell Chen simply stood and watched the ocean, grateful to be alive, grateful to have survived, grateful for the strange and winding path that had brought her here. Behind her, someone called her name. She turned, smiled, and walked back to join the others, her fellow travelers through time, her companions in impossibility, her unlikely family forged in the crucible of the inexplicable. They had taken off from New York in 1964, but the control tower had received their signal only in 2008, and in the years between and after, they had learned that time was more flexible, more mysterious, and more strange than anyone had ever imagined. Their flight had ended, but their stories, their lives continued, and that in the end was all anyone could ask for.